Hello, today I'm in the eastern Brecon Beacons or Bannau Brycheiniog National Park, and today I'm having a walk above the Usk Valley, above the village of Bwlch and just west of Krakow, and we're going to have a look at some of the geological features and landscape and a bit of the ecology and archaeology of this landscape. Just to get an idea of cursory exploration of some of these features that make this such an interesting landscape, and how the geology and ecology has shaped a lot of the history and land use of this part of the UK. So above Bwlch we have the hill fort of Alt Irisger, forgive my Welsh again, and you can see clearly the ditches and ramparts that encircle the hilltop, which made up the Iron Age hill fort. So one of the first things we notice about the landscape of Bannau Brycheiniog is the sort of lumpy hills and low mountains. This was created by glaciation. Much of this area was under ice in the last 2 million years, and the last ice age of about 11,000 years ago has created a lot of these deep valleys. You can see that big U-shaped valley down there where the River Usk is, and then the more deeper, steeper V-shaped valleys are often created more by water erosion. So here we are overlooking Llangors Lake, which is the largest natural lake in South Wales, and you can see it's a slightly different landscape down there. It's a bit flatter, more like a bit of a bowl, with slightly lower, softer hills. Now that's generally made by moraine, which is a dumping of glacial material of sand and gravel and soils and rocks that are all left as the glacier is retreating. So it creates sort of dams that allow meltwater to stay trapped behind them, and because it's a kind of flat bottomed valley, creates a lake. So you've got a large glacial lake there. Apparently it's all silted up nowadays, and that's what makes it extremely shallow. So here's a really good example of dry stone walling. Which is another way that people have used the landscape and used materials to hand to create fences and enclosures and boundaries and all manner of useful things using the natural material found here, this limestone, which as a sedimentary rock breaks off nicely into these straight cleavage lines, which lends itself to dry stone walling. Now some of the plant life that's up here nowadays, since the Neolithic people cleared the trees, is dominated by low shrubby plants such as gorse and heather, occasional coppiced woodlands, birch and alder. So walking along the Beacons Way, I'm struck by a few things about the landscape. Now, as you can see, much of it is not treed. Back in the Neolithic, people started clearing the land to make pasture for grazing animals. I just heard a sheep, so it's a still ongoing process, and altered the ecology significantly. Now that being said, above about 600 metres there's no trees anyway, but much of this landscape that you see today has evolved over a really long time. So despite the fact that it's no longer treed and often considered less biodiverse, that's not necessarily the case. although these days one of the big problems is this bracken fern. It is a native species, but it is super invasive and can cause all sorts of grief by clogging out other species and reducing biodiversity. And it is also a host species for ticks, which are very yucky and can spread Lyme disease. So not ideal. A lot of ecology groups do things like bracken whacking days, where they try to control it by whacking it, because it's not very easy to control with herbicides, which you obviously don't want to use. So it makes for kind of a monoculture landscape in many parts of the Bannau Brycheiniog. But that being said, there's little valleys of trees and thickets and gorse, heather, various grasses, lichens, liverworts, mosses. So it can be quite a diverse landscape, despite being very few trees on it. The other thing I think about as I walk through these various different ecosystems of moorland and scrubland and thickets is I think about biodiversity and why it's so important. A lot of people talk about it, oh, we need more biodiversity, but they don't really know what it is. Well, a good example is to think about if you have a monoculture, a monocrop, let's say, one species covering a huge swathe of land, and a disease comes along or a pest comes along, it can decimate it so easily, and that's the end of that. Easy peasy, wipes it out. So that makes that particular species extremely vulnerable. So if you have many different species over a landscape, then you can resist many diseases. So biodiversity functions for the benefit of everyone in many ways. There's a good example of the sedimentary limestone that forms much of the foundation of Bannau Brycheiniog. So you can see that steep valley there. That's a good example of a valley carved out by water. You can even see some of the rills along the hillside that are currently being created by the water that runs off today. So I've gotten a bit higher now, away from a lot of that bracken fern, into the more natural moorland, populated with heather and some mosses and lichens, as we work our way to the summit. So I've passed Mynydd Troed. She didn't have a trig, so I'm cracking on. Might try going up to Mynydd Troed over there. I've come across this neat outcrop. Almost a sheer limestone cliff here. You can see that valley carved out by glacial meltwater. Very steep. Alright, so I've come off that ridge up there, down into the valley, and then up the steepest way you could possibly do up this path towards the summit, Mynydd Troed, and there is the trig moving into view. So nearly back at the hostel. That's Crackowl in the background, you can see the lights. I've had to walk quite a bit in the dark and in the mist, but that's alright, using my compass, nearly there.